But yeah, certainly the momentum for constitutional carry, for permitless carry, has been incredible over these last decade. Really just a decade. You've gone from it being a tiny fringe policy by states with really minuscule populations like Vermont and Alaska to being the dominant policy and about to be the policy in half the country, with some possibility that even the Supreme Court could mandate it as necessary under the Second Amendment. I don't think that's the likely outcome of the gun carry case that they're hearing right now, but it's not an impossibility. And so and really even going further back than that, because, yes, constitutional carry has swept across in very quick succession. But I mean, it was not that long ago that you couldn't legally conceal a firearm in the vast majority of the country at all, whether you had a permit. There was no permitting process. It was just outright illegal for long periods of time. And yeah, it's been interesting to see that change, because for a long time too, it wasn't like there was overwhelming polling support for this policy. This is very much an activist-driven change, I think. You had the gun rights activists who care deeply about this issue pushing for this change. And, whereas the general public might not even necessarily notice that the change is happening. And if you do an opinion poll, until very recently, it polls poorly among the general population. But at the same time, like you said, it's harder to establish that there's been any direct correlation between these policy changes and increases in concealed carry crimes, right? And so that's, I think, what's kept it moving, because there hasn't been major backlash. You've never once seen a state go from a stricter gun carry law to from a less strict law back to a stricter law. That hasn't happened. So it's incredible.
Another thing that's interesting about this, I think, is that while one half of the states have now adopted these policies, 2/3 of the geographical area of the United States is under a constitutional carry system. And the reason that matters, I know people get funny about this because they say, well, land doesn't vote, people vote. Absolutely true. But people move across land. And especially in America where they drive, it is really useful to have a system in which one doesn't have to worry about permits if one is driving with a firearm. We've all looked up the laws on the East Coast Drive to find out where we can and can't carry and which guns are allowed and when they're not. And, even if you invoke the Firearms Owners Protection Act, which allows you to get from A to B, you still have to be legal in A and in B. But, I mean, if Florida does add itself, and Georgia does in a week or so as well, you'll be able to drive from Florida to North Dakota without ever having to worry about permits or reciprocity or any of it.
I think that's a good point, because it's important to dial in on what the actual practical effect of this policy is. Because in real life, there's plenty to talk about when it comes to whether someone should carry a gun, what the responsibilities are for somebody who wants to carry a gun, and the kind of training they ought to get. But one of the most common critiques of permitless carry is that it eliminates the training requirements. But the thing is, and I'm a certified instructor who teaches the basic pistol course that will qualify you for a Virginia concealed carry permit. And I can tell you that course doesn't teach you really anything about gun carry. It teaches you about pistols and how to safely operate them and maintain them, and how ammunition works and how the gun actually operates and so forth. But it doesn't, the thing is, like in Virginia, and I'm using Virginia because that's the example I know best. I mean, you could use something like discharge papers from the military. Like people really wildly overestimate, I think, oftentimes what the training requirements actually are in most of these states to get the permit. So, I don't know that is something that has protected the public in places that have permitting. And at the same time, like, what is the practical use of this law by police? And, oftentimes, as we've seen public defenders come out and say, whether it's in the Supreme Court case or there was recently a press conference in Detroit by a number of public defenders. These laws are used disproportionately against minorities who are carrying guns without permits. And, what it really is eliminating is just the charge of having a gun on you without any further proof that you've done anything wrong or intended to commit any other sort of crime. And so that's sort of the practical output. And like I mentioned there, you should consider how those crimes are actually charged in real life as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and people also misunderstand what constitutional carry does. I just see every single time I write about this, I get emails from people who say, well, it's crazy to allow anyone to carry a gun. That's not what this does. Right. It just inverts the presumption such that you don't have to apply to demonstrate it. All those who are prohibited from buying or owning or possessing or carrying a firearm are still prohibited.
Right.
So
if you're a prohibited person,
it doesn't.
You can't even touch a gun. It doesn't,
right.
That's the reality. It doesn't change who's prohibited from owning firearms or from possessing firearms. All it does is eliminate this permit and that's what I mean by like these charges that get brought where they're not connected to some other crime. In Detroit, at least according to the public defenders there, 97% of those arrests were for Black males. And when that was the only charge. And that's really what this eliminates is that those situations where it's the only charge. Because if somebody goes out and commits a crime with a gun, you can still charge them for armed robbery or whatever it may be, assault with a deadly weapon. It has no effect on that constitutional carry. All it has an effect on is this when you're charging somebody for carrying a gun without a permit. And so you can see why some police groups might oppose this as they might oppose a broader reading of the Fourth Amendment because it makes police work more difficult. In theory, you can't just catching someone with a gun doesn't inherently make it a crime anymore in states that have permitless carry. And so, police might think that takes a tool away from them, right? But if you're a civil libertarian, obviously the priority isn't necessarily how easy it is for police to do their jobs, right?
Yeah, and a good example of illustrating this is Florida's rules on vehicular carry, because in Florida, to carry in your car, you need no license whatsoever. You just need to be eligible. The car under Florida law is an extension of your home. It's your domicile. So a person can move down to Florida, become a resident here, and then put their gun in their glove box and drive around. They don't need a permit. If they put it in their belt when they walk around in the street, then they need a permit. Now, it's not obvious to me why that is the case or what the real difference is. So we already, in one sense, have constitutional carry. You just have to be in a car when you do it. And I find that amusing also because one of the arguments against concealed carry in general, which of course never came to fruition, but if you look back into the late 80s, especially in Florida in 1987, when it passed shall issue, and the New York Times sort of went crazy over this, wrote all those pieces about the gunshine state. Was people are just going to murder each other all the time on the roads. People are going to murder each other all the time in the supermarkets. Well, this didn't happen. But I mean, assume that would be the problem. Well, then you wouldn't want to allow people without a permit to carry in their car. And yet we do.
Right.
So the permitting system just seems to me to be a little bit arbitrary, given that there's no statistical difference between having one and not having one.
Yeah, it absolutely can be. I mean, Virginia is very similar. I mean, in Virginia, open carry is legal without a permit here. And this extends to your car as well. You can have a loaded gun in your car if it's open, if you like lay it on your seat next to you.
Yeah.
But if it's underneath a newspaper, that's not legal. And it gets even more complicated because I believe this was about 10 years ago, the Republican Attorney General at the time issued an opinion that said you can have a loaded gun in your car without a permit if it's in a container like like your glove box. So similar idea there in Florida,
right?
But in Virginia, so this actually came up if you remember there was an army officer, I believe, he was pulled over at a gas station, and it became a whole incident because he got pepper sprayed, and he sued the police over this. But one of the issues at hand was that he had a gun, and I remember Greg Kelly, he's the host of Newsmax. A host on Newsmax, and he had freaked out about the fact that this guy had a gun in his car and wasn't out yet about whether he had a permit or not, and he was like yelling that this guy was a criminal. And I was like, well, no, because if that gun was in a container, he didn't even need a permit for it. Right. But that sort of speaks to the absurdity of it. So if it had been in a container, it's legal. If it's in like your side door, not legal. If it's out on your seat, legal. There's a lot. This is why I always tell people in Virginia if they want to own a handgun, they ought to get a concealed carry permit, even if they don't ever intend on carrying it on their person anywhere, because really transporting it around can get you in just as much trouble. You could get charged over that stuff. And, if you don't transport it properly, if it's loaded when it's supposed to be unloaded, and the police pull you over and they consider it to be concealed instead of openly carried, or whatever it might be, or even if they might not even, of course, know some of these exceptions and arrest you anyway. But the point is, like, there's a lot of arbitrariness that goes into these distinctions, especially in states where it's you don't have a permit requirement for open carry, but you do for concealed carry, and so. Yeah, I mean, I think that goes along with the point you were making about the complexities of this, and why people support streamlining it by just removing the permitting process.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say on this trend is that it's once again worth reminding people that this was not a policy that was imposed by the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court has largely stayed out of this. Now, there is going to be a carry case this year, although I don't think it will reach the question of constitutional carry. The change in this, both the original adoption of concealed carry permits and move to shall issue, and then the adoption of constitutional carry, has been achieved by legislatures. Legislatures full of people who won elections and then were put up for election and re-elected. It was not imposed by Justice Scalia. It was not an edict that came down from on high. It was not state Supreme Courts that did this. It was legislatures, and governors signed it. And you're right about public opinion. It's rare that you see a poll showing majorities thrilled by the idea, but they also don't hate it, because if they did, you wouldn't have this many states doing it. You would see people losing elections over it. It's just not a salient issue for people. And again, the reason for that is that they have worked out by now that every time that the concealed carry rules are loosened, someone stands up and says this is going to lead to disastrous consequences, and it just doesn't.
They still say that, by the way. You still have
no, they do. Well, I mean, I remember with that when Illinois became the last state to adopt concealed carry in 2015. The governor, I think Quinn was his name, the governor said, we can't have this because if we do, people are going to be shooting each other in the supermarket. And I thought, I actually would have had some sympathy for the people who made that prediction in the 1980s, because we didn't actually know what was going to happen in the modern era if we just passed shall issue concealed carry everywhere. But to be saying that 30 years later was preposterous. Just totally preposterous. And yet they still went with it. So
I think it's an interesting point, though, because like you said, public polling is not the only way to judge whether the popularity of an issue, or at least how it's going to play out politically. Because, I mean, universal background checks would be another obvious example of this, where support for universal background checks is extremely high. But, and obviously you have some blue states that have adopted that policy, but you haven't seen Republicans run out of town in all the red states because they don't adopt it. And you've even seen places like Maine go the other way in referendums, where it's voters directly voting on the issue. So even though it polls really well, so this is important to keep in mind when we talk about these policies. It's like polling is not the only gauge, and while so it was Illinois and DC were forced into shall issue by by federal judges, but every other state wasn't. The Supreme Court is probably going to clean up the last 8 or so here, but that's a good point. I mean, this was by and large a grassroots movement of dedicated activists across the country who got this done. It wasn't necessarily, it certainly wasn't the courts by and large that did it. As you've seen with some other social issue policies being put into place. And so it's fascinating to see how this has played out. And it's really incredible the acceleration we've seen over the last decade, obviously from, they got gun rights activists got shall issue in place, and then they went right to permitless carry, and that's moved even faster.